He said it so quietly that Gertrude Monroe almost did not hear it over the howl of the October wind that swept down from the Colorado Rockies and rattled every shutter on her farmhouse. She had been standing in the open doorway with a lantern raised in her right hand, the flame bending sideways in the gust, and she had been fully prepared to send this stranger away. She had a loaded shotgun leaning against the interior doorframe, close enough that she could reach it in one single step, and her hand had already started its journey toward that stock when the man on her porch opened his cracked lips and spoke those words that stopped everything inside her. "I think I have been looking for you." He was a wreck. There was no other word for it. He was tall, broad through the shoulders, and he might have been powerful once, but right now he was barely standing. His left arm was pressed against his ribs in a way that said something underneath was either broken or badly torn. His ranger's badge, a silver star with the words Texas Ranger pressed into the metal, was hanging from his coat by a single bent pin, catching the lantern light and throwing it back at her in a faint, fractured gleam. His face was split above the left eyebrow, the blood dried black in the cold air, and his eyes, which were a shade of gray she could not name with any word she had ready, were looking at her with an expression she had never seen directed at herself in all 31 years of her life. It was not desperation. It was not the hollow look of a man who only needed a bed and would say anything to get one. It was recognition, deep, soul-level recognition. As though he had been carrying a portrait of her inside his chest for years and had just opened a door and found the real woman standing there in the original. She did not reach for the shotgun. She did not tell him to move along. She stood there in the wind and the lamplight and looked at Hugh Redmond, Texas Ranger, broken and blood-soaked on her porch in the autumn of 1882, and felt something shift in the very foundation of the life she had been building alone on this Colorado flatland for the past 3 years. She did not know his name yet. She did not know his dark past or the secrets he carried in the battered leather saddlebag that was the only thing keeping him upright. The strap looped over his right shoulder so that even the bag itself seemed to be supporting him. She did not know about the betrayal that had shattered his life 6 months ago in a Texas courthouse, or the hidden motive behind the mission that had driven him north through New Mexico and into the Colorado Territory. She did not know that the reason he was broken was not entirely the fault of the men who had put a bullet along his ribs 3 days back. A part of him had been broken long before that, but she stepped aside to let him in. And that is where this story truly begins. 3 years before Hugh Redmond appeared on Gertrude Monroe's porch, she had arrived in the Colorado Territory with $47, a wagon full of seed, hand tools, and her dead husband's name on a land deed. Thomas Monroe had never actually seen the land he purchased through a speculative venture advertised in a Topeka newspaper. He had signed the papers in January of 1879 and been dead of a ruptured appendix by March of the same year, leaving Gertrude with the deed, the debt on the seed money he had borrowed from his brother, and the choice of staying in Topeka as a widow who would eventually be absorbed into someone else's story, or going west to the land and writing her own. She went west. She was 28 years old and she had never been meek, which was something Thomas had loved about her, and something that had also, in the quieter hours of their 4-year marriage, made him uncomfortable. She had a practical mind, strong hands, a sharp tongue that she deployed with surgical accuracy when she felt wronged, and a heart that she kept more closely guarded than most people suspected from looking at her. She had grown up on a Missouri farm and she understood soil and seasons and the fundamental bargain of the land, which was this: you give it everything, and if you are fortunate, it gives enough back to survive. The homestead near the town of Cimarron Springs, Colorado, was 160 acres under the Homestead Act. The land was good, hard, windswept, sometimes brutal, but good. The soil in the lower 40 was rich dark loam that held water through the dry spells. She put in wheat. She put in a kitchen garden. She repaired the single-room cabin that had been built by the previous claimant who had abandoned the deed after 2 bad winters, added a sleeping loft, a covered porch, a proper root cellar, and a small barn for the 2 horses and 4 cows she acquired through trade and careful saving over the first year. She hired a hand when harvest demanded more than 1 pair of arms. A quiet older man named Samuel Bates who lived in town and worked 3 farms besides hers and never said anything he did not mean. She sold enough wheat in the autumn of 1881 to pay off Thomas's brother in full, which gave her a satisfaction so clean and complete it felt almost sacred. She was free of the debt. She was free of the obligation. The land was hers. Her life was hers. She told herself she was content. She almost believed it. Then October of 1882 arrived with its cold teeth and its long nights, and on a Tuesday evening when the wind was coming down hard from the high country, Gertrude Monroe raised her lantern and opened her door to a broken Texas Ranger who looked at her like she was the answer to something he had been asking for a very long time. She guided him to the chair by the kitchen table. He sat down heavily, one hand pressed to his ribs, and the saddlebag slid off his shoulder with a thud onto the plank floor. He did not reach for it with any urgency, which told her whatever was in it was not a weapon he needed quickly. She kept that information in the back of her mind and set her lantern on the table and got a look at him in proper light. He was perhaps 34 or 35. Sun-darkened skin, the kind that came from years of outdoor work rather than one good summer. His hair was dark brown, cut rough, as though he had done it himself with a knife. The jaw was strong and square and covered in 4 or 5 days of beard. The gray eyes, now that she was close enough to see them clearly, had flecks of dark blue in them, and they were tracking her movements with an alertness that told her whatever else was wrong with him. He was not confused or fevered. His mind was sharp. He was simply damaged. "How bad is the rib?" she asked. "Cracked. Maybe 2 of them, not broken through." "How do you know?" "Because I have had broken through before," he said, "and I am still breathing without screaming." She accepted that and went to the cupboard for her medical tin, which she kept well stocked because on a farm 3 miles from town, a well-stocked medical tin was not optional, it was survival. She had carbolic acid, linen bandaging, a needle and silk thread, laudanum she kept for genuine emergencies, and a bottle of plain whiskey she used medicinally and occasionally not medicinally. "Coat off," she said. He got the coat off with slow, careful movements, and she saw that his shirt underneath was blood-soaked on the left side, the fabric stiff and dark where it had dried. She helped him ease it over his head, and the sight of his torso told a story more complicated than she had initially read. The bullet had grazed along the lower ribs, cutting a channel through the skin 3 inches long but not penetrating the chest cavity, which was why he was alive. The ribs beneath the wound were deeply bruised and at least one was cracked. She could feel it with 2 fingers pressed carefully along the bone. But there were older marks too, scars. A long one diagonal across his left shoulder blade. A small, puckered one near his right hip. The map of a life lived in harm's way. She cleaned the wound without a word. He did not make a sound, though the carbolic acid would have burned like fire. When she had the wound clean and wrapped in linen, she straightened and looked at him. "You want to tell me what you said on the porch?" she asked. He met her eyes. "I meant it." "That is not an explanation." "No," he said, "it is not." He was quiet for a moment, and she let him be quiet because she could see that he was arranging something in his mind, deciding how much truth to offer. "My name is Hugh Redmond. I am a Texas Ranger, was a Texas Ranger. I am not entirely sure which of those is true right now." She sat down across the table from him and crossed her arms. "Gertrude Monroe, this is my farm." "I know," he said, and then caught the look on her face and added quickly, "I passed your neighbor, a man named Bates, on the road 2 miles back. He told me there was a farm ahead and a woman alone running it. He described you." "Samuel told you I was alone." "He told me you were capable," Hugh said. "The alone part I inferred from the fact that there is 1 set of boot prints in the mud near your barn and they are small." She looked at him steadily. "You are observant for a man who can barely sit up. Force of habit." He reached for the saddlebag on the floor, moving slowly, and she watched him without flinching. He did not produce a weapon. He produced a folded piece of paper and set it on the table. She did not reach for it. She waited. "There is a man named Caleb Dodd," Hugh said. "He operates a land acquisition operation out of a town called Ridge Creek, which is 22 miles northeast of here. For the past 2 years, he has been forcing homesteaders off their claims using threats, manufactured legal disputes, forged documents, and when those do not work, direct violence. He has taken 17 properties. The families who own them are either gone or dead." Gertrude looked at the paper. "And this involves me how?" "Because his operation just expanded south," Hugh said. "The document on the table is a copy of a deed transfer that was filed with the Territorial Land Office in Denver 3 weeks ago. It transfers your 160 acres to a land company called Prairie Crown Holdings. Prairie Crown Holdings is Caleb Dodd." The silence that followed was absolute. Gertrude unfolded the paper. She read it twice. Her face did not change outwardly, but inside, something cold and sharp pressed against her sternum. 3 years. 3 years of labor and grief and solitude and sacrifice and the grinding, relentless work of building something that was entirely and completely hers. They had filed against her land. They had forged her name on a deed transfer she had never seen, never signed, never consented to. "This is forged," she said. Her voice was flat and hard. "Yes," Hugh said. "The land office accepted it. The land office clerk who accepted it is on Dodd's payroll." Hugh watched her face. "The territorial judge assigned to the district court that would hear any challenge is also connected to Dodd. I do not know yet if that connection is financial or coerced, but it is there." "So the legal system is captured," she said. "In this district, yes." She set the paper down and looked at him. "Why are you here? Why are you bringing this to me instead of to the Ranger Command or the federal authorities?" And here was where the dark past arrived, carried in the lines around his eyes and the careful way he considered her before he answered. "6 months ago," Hugh said, "I was stationed in a small Texas town called Beaumont Crossing. I had been building a case against a land syndicate operating in East Texas, similar operation to Dodd's, same methods. Forged deeds, bribed officials, violence against families who resisted. I had 18 months of evidence. Witness statements, original documents, financial records. I brought the case to the district commander of the Rangers and requested federal support." He paused. "The commander handed my case file directly to the syndicate's lawyer. Every witness I had was visited within 48 hours. 2 recanted under threat. 1 disappeared. The records that had been in my possession were declared inadmissible due to alleged chain of custody violations that I am absolutely certain were manufactured." "The commander betrayed you," Gertrude said. "The commander was the syndicate's man, had been for years. I simply did not know it." Hugh looked at the table. The case collapsed. "The syndicate's principals walked free. I was investigated for misconduct, the theory being that I had fabricated evidence. I was cleared of that charge for lack of proof, but my reputation in the Rangers was gone. My commanding officer reassigned me to the most remote posting available, which was scouting and patrol work in the New Mexico territory. 2 months ago, a source I trust passed me information about Dodd's operation in Colorado. 17 families, Gertrude, gone. Most with nowhere to go. She noticed he had used her first name. She chose not to remark on it because it felt natural in a way that was slightly unsettling, given that she had known this man for approximately 40 minutes. "The men who shot you," she said. "Dodd's men, 3 of them on the road from Ridge Creek. They knew I was coming." "How?" "That," he said, "is what I have been asking myself for 3 days." He looked at her directly. "Someone told them. I have a short list of people who knew my route. I trust none of them fully right now." "You are alone in this," she said. "I am alone in this," he confirmed. She stood up and went to the window and looked out at the dark Colorado night. The wind had not let up. The fields she had plowed and sown and harvested were out there in the blackness, and underneath them was the soil she had turned with her own hands, and somewhere in Denver there was a piece of paper with a forged signature that said all of it belonged to someone else. "You could have sent a letter," she said without turning. "You could have had someone ride ahead and warn me. Instead you rode here yourself hurt and you came to my door. Why?" The silence stretched. "Because I needed to see if it was real," Hugh said. She turned from the window. What was real? He looked at her with those gray eyes that held something she was still struggling to categorize. "I have been doing this for 6 years," he said. "Building cases, gathering evidence, trying to protect people who cannot protect themselves, and watching it fail because the system I work within is not as clean as I believed it was when I pinned this badge on. I have watched families lose everything and had no remedy to offer them. I have made promises I could not keep." He paused. "When I got the information about your farm specifically, there was something else in the file my source sent. A description. Your history, what you had built here, how you had built it." Something shifted in his expression. "I have been riding for 3 weeks and sleeping on cold ground and bleeding since Thursday, and I have been asking myself the entire time why this particular case feels different from every other one I have taken. I told myself it was because of Beaumont Crossing, that I needed to succeed at something after the catastrophe of that betrayal. But that is not entirely true." Gertrude waited. "I think I came here because I needed to meet someone who was still trying," Hugh said quietly. "Who had not given up on the thing they were building just because the world made it hard. I needed to remember that it was possible." He stopped. "That probably sounds like the speech of a man who is mildly delirious from blood loss." "You are not delirious," she said. "You are honest. In my experience, those two things are frequently confused." Something moved across his face that was almost a smile, and the effect of it on his otherwise battered features was startling. It changed the whole arrangement, softened the severity, and showed her something underneath the damage that she would find herself thinking about for a long time after he went asleep. She set him up in the barn that first night because it was not appropriate to put a man she had known for 3 hours in her sleeping loft, and he did not argue the point, which told her he had manners underneath the roughness. She gave him 2 blankets, a tin cup of hot broth she ladled from the pot on the stove, and her second lantern. He thanked her with a simplicity that she found more affecting than any elaborate courtesy. In the morning she found him awake before her, already in the yard, moving carefully but working. He had fed the horses and the cows. He had carried 2 buckets of water from the well. He was not doing it to demonstrate anything or to establish a claim to her gratitude. He was doing it because the animals needed tending and he was there. She stood on the porch and watched him for a moment before he noticed her. "Your ribs," she said. "Are fine," he said. "They are cracked." "They have been cracked before," he said, and she recognized the echo of their conversation from the night before and felt, against her better judgment and considerable will, a small warmth in her chest. She made him come inside for breakfast. She had eggs and salt pork and cornbread from the previous evening that was still good, and she brewed coffee that was strong enough to strip paint, which was the only way she knew how to make it and the only way she wanted it. He ate with the focused attention of a man who had been underfed for a significant stretch of time, and she understood that this was not theater. He was genuinely hungry. Between cups of coffee, they talked about Caleb Dodd. Hugh had assembled a significant picture of the man over the past 2 months, and he laid it out for her with the methodical precision of someone who had spent years learning to construct a narrative of criminal activity that could survive a courtroom. Dodd was 43 years old, originally from Missouri, which was where the story of his ambitions had begun. He had arrived in Colorado Territory in 1878, with capital obtained through methods that were never fully investigated, and he had begun purchasing land claims in the Ridge Creek area with legitimate money. Then the legitimate money ran short, and Dodd discovered that in the relative administrative chaos of a territory that had only become a state 2 years before, in 1876, the land records were imperfect, and the officials who maintained them were underpaid and susceptible to supplemental income. He built his system gradually. A clerk here, a deputy there, a judge who had an expensive habit and a quiet debt. He constructed a web of corruption that was not a single conspiracy, but a series of bilateral arrangements, each person knowing only what they needed to know, and no one holding the complete picture. It made the operation exceptionally difficult to prosecute because there was no single point of failure, no single informant whose testimony could bring the whole structure down. "What do you need?" Gertrude asked. "Original documents," Hugh said. "Something Dodd signed himself. Something that connects him directly to the forged deeds rather than being traceable only to the clerk who filed them. If I can get that connection established in paper, and if I can get it to the right federal authority, the U.S. Marshal's office in Denver rather than the territorial court system which is compromised, I believe I can break this." "Where are the original documents?" "Dodd's office in Ridge Creek." He said it with the steadiness of someone who had already made a decision that scared him and was now past the fear. "You intend to go there," she said. "Not immediately. I need to be functional first, and I need to know whether you will cooperate with a federal investigation when the Marshal's office contacts you." "Of course I will cooperate," she said sharply. "It is my land they forged against." "There are people in your situation who are too frightened to cooperate," he said. It was not a criticism, simply a statement of what he had encountered. "I am not frightened," she said. Then, because honesty demanded it, "I am angry." His mouth curved again in that unexpected way. "Good," he said. "Angry is useful. Frightened just runs." He stayed. He stayed because his ribs needed 2 weeks minimum before he could ride hard, and because the farmhouse was defensible in ways his camping on open ground was not, and because Gertrude Monroe did not ask him to leave. She gave him the barn, and then, after the second night when the temperature dropped sharply, and she woke to find a skiff of early snow on the ground, she moved him to the small room off the kitchen that had originally been intended as a pantry, and that she had fitted with a cot and a set of shelves. It was not large, but it was warm, and warmth mattered when a man had cracked ribs and a healing wound. They developed a routine that felt within 3 days as though it had always existed. He rose before her and tended the animals. She made breakfast. They worked through the morning at whatever the farm required, and in the Colorado Territory in late October there was no shortage of work. The wheat had been brought in, but the equipment needed maintenance before winter set in. The root cellar needed its shelves checked and its stores inventoried. The barn needed rechinked along the north wall where the wind got through. In the afternoons, when the light was good, he sat at her table and wrote. She would glance at the pages and see the tight, clear hand of a man writing up his evidence, constructing the chain of documentation that would support the case he was building toward. In the evenings they talked. The talking was what began to dismantle her careful walls, not in a sudden catastrophic collapse, but in the slow, determined way that water works on stone. He was intelligent in a way she had rarely encountered in a man who directed that intelligence at her, fully, as though what she thought and what she had experienced genuinely mattered to him. He asked about her farm, and when she explained the decisions she had made about crop rotation and water management, he did not nod politely and redirect to something he considered more important. He engaged with it. He had questions. He connected what she told him about the land to larger patterns he had observed riding through the territory. He told her about his life before the badge. He had grown up in Virginia, the son of a schoolteacher and a man who ran a small newspaper. The Civil War had ended when he was 10 years old, but the aftermath of it had shaped his adolescence in ways he was still untangling. His older brother had fought for the Confederacy and come home wrong in ways that no one in the family knew how to address. His father had lost the newspaper to debt in 1868. The family had come apart slowly, like a rope fraying strand by strand, and by the time Hugh was 17, he had understood that staying meant absorbing a slow tragedy, and leaving meant at least the possibility of something else. He had gone to Texas because Texas was where men with no remaining family ties, and a need to prove something useful went in those years. He had done ranch work, then scouted for the army, which was where he had learned to read land and track movement and observe without being observed. The Rangers had recruited him in 1874 because his commander in the army thought his skills were wasted on military patrol. He had been a ranger for 8 years. "Do you miss it?" Gertrude asked one evening. "The certainty of it, knowing who you were." He was quiet for a moment, looking at the lamp. "I miss who I thought I was before Beaumont Crossing," he said. "The man who believed the institution he served was essentially sound." "That is a comfortable thing to believe, and I miss the comfort of it." He looked at her. "But I am not sure I miss the blindness that went with it." "A forced choice," she said. "Comfort or truth?" "Always," he said. "In my experience, those two things rarely share the same address." She thought about Thomas, who had been a good man but who had made decisions that assumed her comfort and never troubled himself to ask what truth she wanted. She thought about the solitude of the past 3 years and how she had told herself it was freedom, and how sometimes, particularly in the long nights, it had felt like something else entirely. "You were married," Hugh said. It was not a question. He had seen the plain band she still wore on her right hand, moved from the left after Thomas died. She had moved it partly to signal widowhood and partly because taking it off entirely had felt like a violence she was not ready to commit. "For years," she said, "he was a decent man. He loved me in the way he understood love, which was providing and protecting. He did not always understand that I was also capable of providing and protecting, and that partnership requires acknowledging that in the other person." "Did you tell him that?" "I tried. He heard it as criticism, and I eventually stopped trying, which was my fault as much as his. We were both young, and neither of us had been taught the language for that conversation." She paused. "I loved him. I grieved him genuinely. But there is a particular grief that comes with losing someone before you had the chance to fully know each other, and that is its own specific sorrow." Hugh was looking at her in a way that made the lamplight feel very warm and the room very small. He said, "I was engaged 9 years ago. Her name was Lydia. She ended it when she understood that the ranger work was not temporary but permanent, that I was not going to become something more settled. She was right to end it. We would have made each other miserable, but I carried the failure of it for a long time. As a secret," Gertrude said. "As a dark place I did not often take people into," he corrected. "There is a difference." "Is there?" "A secret implies intent to deceive," he said. "A dark place is simply territory you have not yet found the right guide for." She felt that land in her chest and said nothing immediately, because she needed to keep hold of herself, and Hugh Redmond, she was beginning to understand, was the kind of man who could make her lose her footing without appearing to try. On the 9th day of his stay, Samuel Bates came by with the monthly supplies she had ordered from town. He was a weathered man of 52, taciturn and honest, and when he saw Hugh in the yard repairing the fence line, he stopped his wagon and looked at Gertrude with an expression that contained several questions compressed into a single raised eyebrow. "Samuel," she said pleasantly, "help me carry these in." Inside, while Hugh stayed in the yard, Samuel said quietly, "He is a ranger." "He says he was," she said. "Currently he is a man with cracked ribs helping me repair a fence." "He come here on purpose," Samuel said. It was not a question. "He did." "You know why," she told Samuel enough. "The forged deed, Dodd's operation, the nature of the threat." Samuel listened with his arms crossed and his face still, and when she finished he was quiet for a long moment. "Dodd's men were in town 2 days ago," he said, "asking about a ranger passing through. I told them I had not seen any ranger." He looked at her steadily. "I do not like to lie, but I like those men less than I dislike lying." "Samuel," she said, and she meant it fully. "Thank you." "He can stay as long as he needs," Samuel said, as though she had asked permission, which she had not. But she understood the intention behind it, which was simply his manner of saying he would not be a source of trouble for whatever was happening. After Samuel left, Hugh came in from the yard, his breath fogging in the cold air, and she told him what Samuel had said about Dodd's men in town. Hugh's expression sharpened immediately. the warmth that had begun to settle in his features over the past 9 days replaced by the alert, calculated look of the man who had tracked criminals through 2 territories. "They are circling," he said. "They know I reach this area even if they do not know exactly where I am. We have less time than I estimated." How much less? Days rather than weeks. He sat down at the table and pulled his papers toward him. "I need to get to Ridge Creek, but I cannot go in directly. They know my face. I need someone they do not know to go into that town and locate the documents." "I will go," she said. He looked up at her. "Gertrude, do not say I cannot," she said. "Say why it would not work and I will evaluate whether your reasons are sound." He was quiet for a moment, and she could see him adjusting to the fact that she had just declined to accept an objection he had not yet made. Then slowly, he began to work through it rather than against it. "Dodd may have a description of you," he said. "His operation targets specific properties, and he will have researched the owners. He may. But I look like a great many women on Colorado farmsteads, and I have never been to Ridge Creek. If I go as a woman looking to sell land rather than one trying to protect it, the approach is inverted and he has no reason to be suspicious." Hugh sat back. "You want to go to him directly. Land buyers want to purchase land," she said. "If a woman came to Caleb Dodd's office presenting herself as a widow wanting to sell her homestead claim cheaply and quickly for cash, would he not be interested?" "He would be extremely interested," Hugh said slowly. "That is essentially the product he markets, cheap land obtained through any means available. He was working through the trap she was setting in his mind. You could get inside his office." "I could get inside his office," she confirmed. "And while I am there being charming and desperate, you tell me what to look for." "It is dangerous," he said. "If he identifies you, you are a woman who has just walked into a room with a man who arranges violence." "I understand the risk," she said. "I am not sure you do," he said, and his voice had shifted, roughened into something that was not quite professional concern, and they both understood that. She looked at him across the table. The lamp was between them, and the light it threw caught the angles of his face and made the gray of his eyes look very deep. "Hugh," she said, with the quiet, level assurance of a woman who had built a farm alone in a territory that regularly tried to kill people who were not paying attention, "I understand the risk better than you give me credit for. I have been managing risk on my own for 3 years. What I need from you is not protection. It is information. Tell me what to look for." He looked at her for a long moment. Then he told her. They spent 2 days preparing. He described the documents he needed with the precision of a man who had memorized their probable form and content. Land conveyance records bearing the original signatures of willing sellers, in cases where those sellers had later denied ever signing. Correspondence that might establish Dodd's direct ordering of the clerk's falsifications, and any records connecting Prairie Crown holdings to payments to public officials. He taught her to identify these documents by their format, the specific seals used by the Territorial Land Office, the way the column headings in the conveyance records were structured. She went through her wardrobe, which was practical and farm functional, and selected the best dress she owned, a dark blue wool that she wore to church in Cimarron Springs on the occasions when she attended, which was more occasional than regular. She pressed it and set her hair properly, and Hugh watched her across the kitchen, and then looked away with a deliberateness she noticed. "You should not wear the wedding band," he said. "A widow wanting to sell would not have a husband's lawyer to protect her. She would be alone and without resources. That is a more vulnerable position, and Dodd would find it more appealing." She slid Thomas's band from her right hand and set it on the kitchen windowsill. The absence of it felt more significant than it should have, given that it had been on her right hand rather than her left for 3 years. The morning she was to ride to Ridge Creek, which was a 2-hour ride on one of her horses, Hugh came out to the yard as she was saddling up. His ribs were significantly better. He was moving with only moderate caution now, and his eyes were very serious. "If anything feels wrong," he said, "you leave. You do not try to retrieve documents at the cost of your safety. You leave and we find another way." "Agreed," she said. "I mean it, Gertrude." She turned from the horse and looked at him. He was standing in the cold morning light looking at her with an expression that had nothing professional in it at all by this point, and she understood that whatever he was about to say was something he had been deciding whether to say for several days. "I know you do," she said, before he could say it. Not because she did not want to hear it, but because she was not ready for the conversation it would open, not before she had to ride 22 miles into a trap of her own making. She needed her head clear. "I will be back by dark," she rode. Ridge Creek was a town of perhaps 400 people, larger than Cimarron Springs, and it had the slightly overdressed look of a place where money was arriving faster than wisdom. A new hotel with a false front. A bank that was too large for the population it served. Dodd's land office was on the main street in a building that had a freshly painted sign reading Prairie Crown Holdings, Caleb Dodd, Land Management and Conveyance. She tied her horse at the rail and went in. Caleb Dodd was not what she had expected, which was useful because it meant her expression did not falter when she saw him. He was a small man, neat in his person, with a precisely trimmed beard and quick brown eyes behind spectacles, and the mannered courtesy of someone who had learned that charm was a more effective tool than intimidation in the early stages of an acquisition. He greeted her with a warmth that was professionally generated and entirely hollow, and she recognized it immediately because she had encountered versions of it in land speculators and debt collectors in Missouri and Kansas. She introduced herself as Eleanor Marsh, a widow from a homestead near the New Mexico border who had heard Prairie Crown was paying fair prices for willing sellers. She made herself look tired and slightly desperate, which was not entirely acting because she was doing something that could go very badly, and that was a genuine source of internal pressure she was simply not showing on her face. Dodd was warm and interested and asked careful questions. She answered them with the story she and Hugh had constructed, a plausible fabrication about a claim she had never been able to make truly productive, a brother in Kansas City who could take her in, a desire to convert the land to cash and start fresh somewhere with family. Dodd made notes. He offered coffee, which she accepted. And while he went to the side table to pour it, she looked at the filing cabinet behind his desk, whose top drawer was not fully closed, a half-inch of gap showing the edges of hanging files. She looked at the desk surface, where a ledger lay open, and without moving toward it she read, from where she sat, the column headings and the names she could make out in the top entries. Two of those names she recognized from Hugh's list of dispossessed homesteaders. Dodd came back with the coffee. They continued the conversation. He suggested a second meeting once she had retrieved her deed, which she agreed to with an eagerness that she calibrated to seem like relief. He walked her to the door. "Mrs. Marsh," he said pleasantly as she prepared to leave, "I should mention that we have become aware of some irregular activity in the area recently. A man asking questions about our business. If you encounter anyone like that, anyone claiming to represent a government interest in our transactions, I would encourage you to be cautious. Such people are not always what they appear." She kept her face composed. "I will certainly be careful," she said. "Thank you for the warning." She rode back to the farm at a pace she kept deliberately unhurried, because nothing identified a person coming from a suspicious interaction like someone riding as though wolves were behind them. She maintained the even pace for 5 miles, and then, in a long, empty stretch of road with the mountains to her west and the plains to her east, she pressed her heels into the horse's flanks and covered the remaining 17 miles in a fast, focused ride. Hugh heard her coming and was in the yard when she arrived. She swung down from the saddle and he caught the horse's bridle and she told him everything before she had even finished catching her breath. The ledger, the names, the filing cabinet with the open drawer. Dodd's warning at the door. "He knows you are somewhere in the area," she said. "Not who you are exactly, but the shape of you. A man asking questions." "The ledger," Hugh said, and his voice was sharp and focused. "If the homesteader names were in the active ledger with those column headings, that puts the transaction record on his desk, not in the clerk's files, on his desk. He is maintaining his own parallel record. Why would he do that? Control, Hugh said. He wants documentation of what each official owes him for their participation. It is leverage. He can use it against them if they ever consider turning on him. The very document he uses to protect himself from betrayal is also the document that proves his direct involvement in every falsification. He looked at her with a sharpness in his eyes that was quickly overlaid by something much warmer. "You are certain of the column headings." She repeated them from memory, exactly as she had read them across the desk, and she saw him process them and understood from his expression that they confirmed what he had theorized. "That ledger is the case," he said. "That alone, if I can get it to the marshal's office in Denver with an affidavit from you about what you read and where, would be sufficient to open a federal investigation that even Dodd's judge cannot interfere with." "Then we need to get it," she said. "I need to get it," he said. "You have already taken a risk today that I am still processing." She looked at him. "You said I was afraid. I did not say that. You implied my risk assessment was incomplete." "I was concerned for you," he said, and his voice carried no ambiguity. "That is different from implying inadequacy." She looked at him for a long moment, the cold afternoon wind moving between them and lifting a strand of her hair against her cheek. He reached out and smoothed it back with the barest touch of his fingers, and then his hand remained a moment longer than the task required, his fingertips at her temple, and the warmth of it in the cold air was extraordinary. She stepped back, not because she wanted to, but because she needed to think, and she could not think clearly when he touched her. "Tell me how you intend to get into the office," she said. He told her. The plan was audacious and hinged on timing, on the particular hours when Dodd's office would be minimally staffed, and on Hugh's ability to move quietly and quickly through a lock, which was a skill he had acquired during the years of his ranger service, and about which he was matter-of-fact rather than proud. They would need Samuel Bates to carry a message to a specific federal contact Hugh had in Denver, a deputy U.S. Marshal named Thaddeus Vane, who had been Hugh's opposite number on 2 previous cases, and who Hugh trusted unconditionally, because Vane had an incorruptible stubbornness that even Caleb Dodd's money could not afford to test. Samuel came by the following morning and listened without surprise or drama to what they needed him to do. He took Hugh's written message, which was sealed and addressed in a hand that gave away nothing about the sender's location, and said he would take it to the relay rider in Cimarron Springs, who could have it in Denver within 4 days. While they waited, the farm continued to require its attention, and Hugh, who had now been at the farm for 11 days and whose ribs were sufficiently healed to allow full movement, worked alongside Gertrude with an ease that had deepened into something neither of them was openly naming yet. He was good with the animals and better than good with tools. He had the carpenter's instinct of a man who had grown up fixing things, because they could not afford to replace them, and he spent an afternoon replacing 3 rotted fence posts with the steady, absorbed attention of someone who found satisfaction in making broken things sound again. She watched him from the kitchen window longer than she needed to. On the 13th day, while they were eating supper, he set down his fork and looked at her and said, "I want to tell you something that is not about Dodd or the case or what comes next practically." She set down her own fork. "What happened at the door this morning," he said, referring to the moment he had smoothed her hair back with 2 fingers 4 days ago, "was not impulse. I want you to know that. I have been thinking about you, specifically about you, since before I arrived here, and every day I have been here has made it more true and less something I know how to keep behind a professional distance." He stopped. The lamp was between them again, and the light was gold, and the room was warm, and outside the wind was doing what wind in the Colorado high plains did in November, which was declare itself without apology. "I said on the first night that I thought I had been looking for you. I was not certain what I meant by that when I said it. I am more certain now." Gertrude looked at him for a long time. "Hugh," she said, "I have been alone for 3 years, and I have been careful, and I have told myself that the careful life was what I chose, and that I was content with it. And then you showed up on my porch looking like the worst week of your entire existence and said something that went directly through every wall I had built, and I have been irritated about it ever since because I do not like having my walls go through without permission." He looked at her with something in his eyes that was very nearly laughing and very nearly something else. "I apologize for the unauthorized entry," he said. "You do not," she said. "No," he agreed. "I truly do not." She reached across the table and put her hand over his, and that was all that was needed because some things, when they are real, do not require extensive ceremony. He turned his hand over and held hers, and they sat like that for a long time in the lamplight while the wind talked to the windows, and the fire settled in the stove and nothing was said, because nothing needed to be. 2 days later, Deputy U.S. Marshal Thaddeus Vane arrived in Cimarron Springs with 2 deputies, and a federal warrant that had been issued by a federal judge in Denver who sat entirely outside the corrupted district court system, and who had jurisdiction over cases involving fraud on federal land grant documentation. Vane was a large, unhurried man of 45 with a walrus mustache and the flat, patient eyes of someone who had spent 20 years watching people lie to him and had become very good at identifying the moment it started. He rode out to the farmhouse and sat down at Gertrude's table and drank her coffee and listened to Hugh's complete account of the evidence, the document chain, the witness statements Hugh had assembled, and Gertrude's own account of what she had read in Dodd's ledger. Vane sat back when it was done. "The ledger," he said to Gertrude. "You are willing to provide a sworn affidavit as to its contents and your direct observation of it in Dodd's possession." "I am," she said. "This will make you a witness in a federal proceeding," Vane said. "Dodd's legal resources will attempt to challenge your credibility and your account." "I am aware," she said. "My account is true and my credibility is intact. They are welcome to test both." Vane looked at her with the expression of someone who has been pleasantly surprised and does not show it extravagantly. He looked at Hugh. "You got lucky ending up here," he said. "I know," Hugh said, and his eyes went to Gertrude in a way that was entirely unambiguous, and Vane noticed and said nothing and moved on. The raid on Dodd's Ridge Creek office happened on a Friday morning in the 3rd week of November 1882. Vane and his 2 deputies arrived with the federal warrant while Dodd was at his desk. The ledger was exactly where Gertrude had described it. The filing cabinet contained documents that exceeded even Hugh's most optimistic projection of what they might find. A complete organized archive of every falsified transaction, maintained with the meticulous tidiness of a man who valued control so completely that he had kept his own criminal records in perfect order. Caleb Dodd was arrested before noon. The land office clerk was arrested the following day. 2 of his deputies who had been directly involved in the violence against homesteading families were arrested before the end of the week. The territorial judge with the compromised relationship to Dodd was referred for investigation to the federal judicial oversight body in Washington, a process that would move slowly but would move. 17 dispossessed families. The land was not immediately restored because the legal process of unwinding the fraudulent transfers would take months, but the federal warrant froze all of Prairie Crown Holdings' properties pending resolution, which meant no one else could be removed while the process worked. Some families had already moved on and could not be located. Others were found and informed that their cases would be heard. It was not perfect justice. Perfect justice would have required turning back time, and time does not turn. But the forged deed against Gertrude Monroe's farmland was voided within a week of Dodd's arrest. The process expedited because the falsification was not yet fully registered and was the most recently executed document in the portfolio, and therefore the most straightforwardly reversible. A county clerk she had never met rode out to the farmhouse with a written confirmation of the deed's voiding and the reassertion of her original Homestead Act claim, properly documented and witnessed, and handed it to her on her own porch. She held the document with both hands and looked at it for a long moment. Hugh was standing behind her in the doorway, and he did not say anything, because he understood that this was her moment, and it belonged to her entirely. Then she turned around and pressed the document against his chest and put her face against his shoulder, and he put his arms around her, carefully because the ribs were still not perfectly indifferent to pressure, and they stood on her porch in the November cold while the land stretched out in every direction around them. 160 acres of earth that she had earned and protected, and that was, without question or dispute, hers. Thaddeus Vane came by before he returned to Denver to collect the last of Hugh's evidence documentation and to shake Hugh's hand and then, somewhat formally, Gertrude's. "Redmond," Vane said at the end of the conversation with his hat in his hand, "I have sent a report to the Ranger Command in Texas about Beaumont Crossing and about this. You deserve the record corrected." Hugh was quiet. "I am not sure I want to go back to the Rangers," he said. Vane looked at him steadily. "The correction still matters," he said. "What was done to you was wrong, and you should not carry it as a mark against your character." He looked briefly at Gertrude, who was standing near the kitchen table with her arms crossed and her expression telling anyone who was looking that she agreed with Vane completely on this point. "What you do after the correction is your business." Vane left. The deputies left. The road to Ridge Creek was quiet. That evening, Gertrude made the best supper she had made since Hugh arrived, which was a roasted chicken from the coop, boiled potatoes, a relish she had put up in September from the kitchen garden, and cornbread with actual honey she had traded for at the store in August. She did not do this as a celebration of anything specific. She did it because she wanted to, and she had learned in 3 years of solitary farmsteading that the things you wanted to do were worth doing, because there was no one else to do them for you. Hugh ate with the same focused appreciation he had brought to every meal, and looked at her across the table and said, "Are you all right?" It was such a simple question, and he meant it in such a complete way, not just about the events of the past 3 weeks but about the whole landscape of her, that she had to look at the window for a moment before she could answer him. "Yes," she said. Genuinely, she looked back at him. "What are you?" He considered the question with the seriousness it deserved. "I am sitting at the best table I have sat at in years," he said, "eating the best meal I have eaten in years, with the only person I have met in a very long time who makes me feel like the future is a place worth thinking about rather than something to survive. So what I am is fortunate, and aware of it." She reached across and refilled his coffee cup without being asked, and he thanked her, and they finished supper in the comfortable quiet of 2 people who have stopped needing to fill silence. December arrived, and with it proper winter, and Hugh remained. He was not remaining as a guest or a ward of her hospitality. He was working the farm with the full commitment of a man who has determined that this is where he intends to be, and is demonstrating that intention through action rather than declaration. He was competent at everything and excellent at several things, and the farm ran noticeably better with 2 pairs of hands than it had with one, not because Gertrude had been insufficient, but because the farm had always been sized for a partnership that had never existed. He slept in the pantry room still, which was not large but was private, and the arrangement was respectable, and she did not invite him to change it, yet because she was a methodical woman who did not make large decisions quickly. But the distance between them in the evenings in front of the fire was measured in inches rather than the decorous feet of earlier weeks, and the conversations they had moved through the terrain of their lives, with an intimacy that told both of them clearly where this was going. He kissed her for the first time in the 2nd week of December, in the barn while they were both laughing at one of the cows who had managed to tip over her own water bucket, and was looking at the resulting puddle with enormous bovine offense. The laughter had brought their faces close together, and then he had looked at her and she had looked back, and the kissing was as natural as everything else between them had been, which was very natural and slightly overwhelming and entirely right. She stood in the barn holding his coat lapels afterward and looked up at him and said, "Well, Well, he agreed, and he was smiling in the full-faced, unguarded way she had seen only glimpses of before, and that transformed him completely. "If you intend to stay," she said, "we should talk about what that looks like." "I intend to stay," he said without hesitation. "You do not have a position here," she said. "Not as a ranger, not as anyone's employee. You would be staying on a farm in Colorado with a widow who grows wheat and has opinions about soil management and makes coffee that would corrode metal." "I know," he said. "I would like to find that out for myself over the next 40 years. She looked at him for a long, silent moment and then said, "That is rather presumptuous." "Yes," he said, "it is." He was not apologizing for it. She let go of his lapels and walked back toward the farmhouse, and then paused at the barn door and looked back at him. "Come inside," she said. "I will make the corroding coffee, and we can talk about what you intend to do with yourself if you are not a ranger anymore, because I am not going to have a man standing around my farm being decorative." He followed her, and he was still smiling. They talked that evening seriously and at length about practical matters, which was the most romantic conversation Gertrude Monroe had ever had, because it was a conversation between two people treating each other as genuine partners in a shared future, and not dancing around the subject with pretty words that meant nothing when it came to the actual work of living. He had savings, not extravagant amounts, but enough. He had skills beyond law enforcement, the scouting and the carpentry, and the competence with animals that he had demonstrated daily for the past month and a half. He was interested in whether the farm could be expanded, whether a second crop rotation might make sense given the land he had looked over in his daily work. He was also, he said carefully, interested in whether she might consider helping him write up a complete account of the Dodd case for publication in the Denver newspapers, because he thought the public deserved to know what had happened to 17 families, and he did not entirely trust the formal legal process to make it clear enough. She thought that was an excellent idea and said so. She wrote most of it, in fact, because her prose was more precise than his, and she had the additional perspective of having been directly targeted, and the account they produced together was published in the Rocky Mountain News in January of 1883 under both their names. It caused a significant stir in the territory, generated inquiries from two more families who had suspected their land troubles were connected to Dodd's operation, but had not known there was a federal case they could contribute to, and prompted a letter from a Denver attorney who was compiling a civil suit on behalf of the dispossessed homesteaders seeking compensation from Dodd's assets, the letter with both their names on it. She noticed that, and it settled something in her. On a Sunday in January, after church in Cimarron Springs, standing in the cold outside the small whitewashed building while their breath made clouds in the still air, Hugh took both her hands and looked at her and said, "Gertrude, will you marry me?" He said it as a statement of intent rather than a question, which was either arrogance or confidence, and she had decided she was not going to trouble herself distinguishing between the two when the face saying it was this face, and the hands holding hers were these hands, and the life she was being asked to share was the one already taking shape around them. "Yes," she said, "I will." He brought her hands up and pressed them against his jaw and closed his eyes for a moment. And she felt in that gesture something she had not expected to feel again, which was that particular quality of being held like she was the most valuable thing in someone's vicinity. They were married in March of 1883 in the same church, by the same minister who had been conducting Sunday services in Cimarron Springs for 12 years, and who performed the ceremony with the brisk efficiency of a man who has married enough couples to know that the words themselves are only the formal edge of something much larger. Samuel Bates stood as witness, dry-eyed and solemn, shaking Hugh's hand afterward with a firm grip that communicated approximately 300 words of approval in one gesture. She did not wear the dress she had worn to Dodd's office. She wore a cream-colored dress that had been her mother's, which she had carried in her trunk from Missouri to Topeka to Colorado, and which she had altered twice over the years as her body changed with the work of the land. She moved Thomas's ring to the dresser in the bedroom before the ceremony and left it there, not as a rejection of what it had meant, but as an acknowledgement that the chapter it represented was complete, and she was beginning a new one. Hugh wore his best coat and a clean shirt, and had shaved with such care that she ran her fingers along his jaw in the vestibule of the church before the ceremony, and said he looked like a different person, and he said he felt like one. The spring planting of 1883 was done with 2 sets of hands, and went better than any previous spring on the farm. They expanded into the south field that Gertrude had left fallow the previous 2 years because she had not had the time and labor to break it, and the south field turned out to have excellent soil, the same dark loam as the lower 40, and they put winter wheat in it and it took well. Hugh had built, over the winter, an addition to the farmhouse. Not large, just a proper bedroom that attached to the east side of the original structure, because the arrangement of the pantry room off the kitchen had served its purpose and was no longer appropriate. He built it from timber he sourced and milled himself over 3 weeks of winter work, and Gertrude helped with the interior, plastering the walls and fitting the window with a shutter that swung both ways on its hinge. And the room, when it was done, was simple and clean, and had the southwest exposure that meant it caught the afternoon light in a way that was very good. They were happy in it. They were happy in a way that had the texture of something earned rather than found accidentally, because they had both done a great deal of living before they found each other, and they knew what they were grateful for. In October of 1883, exactly a year after Hugh had appeared on her porch in the dark, Gertrude told him she was going to have a child. She told him in the morning over coffee, matter-of-factly, watching his face, which went through several expressions in rapid succession before arriving at one she had not seen before, which was a kind of awed, open joy that made him look younger than she had ever seen him. He sat down. He stood back up. He put his hands on her face and looked at her very carefully, as though she might disappear if he moved too quickly. "You are certain," he said. "I have been certain for 3 weeks," she said. "I waited to be sure before I said it." 3 weeks, he said, processing the waiting. "I am practical," she said. "You are extraordinary," he said, and kissed her forehead and then her mouth and then her forehead again, and she laughed at the ordering of it. Their son was born in June of 1884. He was healthy and loud, and had his father's dark hair and his mother's stubborn jaw, which Hugh observed from the moment the child was 7 hours old, and which Gertrude said was not stubbornness but determination, and they should be careful to use the right word from the start. They named him James Thomas Redmond, the James for no one in particular and simply because they both liked it, and the Thomas for the man whose deed had brought Gertrude west and whose land, through her labor and her courage, had become the foundation of something he had not lived to see, but which she chose to believe he would have admired. James was a robust and demanding child who filled the farmhouse with noise in a way that required a complete reordering of how time moved through a day, and both his parents adapted to this with varying degrees of grace. Hugh was unexpectedly good at the infant-specific work of the thing, patient and unhurried in a way that Gertrude, who loved her son with a ferocity that sometimes startled her, occasionally struggled to match at 3 in the morning when the Colorado wind was banging at the shutters and the child was inconsolable. "Take him," she would say, passing the bundle across, and Hugh would walk the baby through the small farmhouse in the dark, talking to him in a low, continuous murmur about whatever was nearest to hand, the condition of the south field, the behavior of the cows, the stars visible through the window on a clear night, and James would subside, not immediately but eventually, which was the most that could be asked. She watched this from the bed with a love so large it occasionally frightened her. The legal proceedings against Caleb Dodd concluded in the fall of 1884. He was convicted on federal fraud charges and sentenced to 12 years in a federal penitentiary, a sentence that reflected the serious nature of federal land fraud even if it fell short, in Gertrude's private opinion, of fully accounting for the lives disrupted and the families scattered. The land office clerk received 4 years. Several of the associated deputies received shorter sentences, or in 2 cases were released with fines. Outcomes that were infuriating but not surprising given the plea arrangements the federal prosecutors had accepted in exchange for testimony. 9 of the 17 dispossessed families eventually recovered their land through the civil litigation that the Denver attorney had organized. 8 could not be located or had moved permanently on, and chose not to return to claims that had cost them too much. For those 8, the land was held in federal custody for a period, and then, through a process that was messy and imperfect, redistributed to new claimants under the Homestead Act. It was not the outcome anyone would have designed if they could have designed it from the beginning, but it was the outcome that was achievable within the actual systems that existed, and both Gertrude and Hugh had learned by now to distinguish between the perfect justice of imagination and the imperfect but real justice of achieved outcomes. The letter from the Texas Ranger Command arrived in August of 1883, before James was born. It was addressed to Hugh Redmond, and it formally acknowledged that the investigation into his conduct following the Beaumont Crossing case had been reviewed in light of new information, that the record of misconduct had been expunged, and that Hugh's service record was formally restored to good standing. It did not offer an apology in explicit language, because institutions of that era rarely did, but the letter's careful phrasing made its meaning clear enough. Hugh read it at the kitchen table and then set it down. "Do they want you back?" Gertrude asked. "They do not explicitly say so," he said. "The implication is available." She looked at him steadily. She was not going to tell him what to do with this. She had never done that, and she was not going to begin now. He looked back at her and then at the window, and then at the room they were in, the room he had built with his own hands that was part of a house, that was part of a farm, that was part of a life that was not anything he had planned but was more than anything he had previously known how to want. "No," he said simply. "I am where I am supposed to be." She looked at him. "You are sure?" she said. "I have never been more sure of anything," he said. He picked up the letter and set it aside in the stack of papers that would eventually be organized, which was where he put things that were resolved. Then he stood up and looked out at the yard where the late summer sun was warm on the fields. "The south fence needs work before winter." "I know," she said. "I put it on the list." "I will start on it this afternoon," he said, and that was that. The winter of 1884 to 1885 was a hard one. Harder than the previous 2, and the Colorado plains in January showed a side of themselves that was merciless and white and indifferent to the plans of human beings. They stayed close to the house and the barn and burned through the wood they had stacked and the hay they had laid in, and were grateful for the thoroughness of the preparation they had done in autumn. James, at 7 months old, was entirely untroubled by the cold as long as he was held, which was frequently, and which meant one or the other of his parents was almost always in motion through the farmhouse with a warm, substantial infant attached to their person. Hugh built during the winter. He had developed a secondary income in the past year doing carpentry and repair work for other farms, and for the expanded town of Cimarron Springs, which had grown enough to need a properly built school, and had hired him to construct it at a price that was fair to both sides. The school was finished by the following spring and stood for decades, a fact that gave him a quiet satisfaction entirely different from but not less than the satisfaction of completed law enforcement work. Gertrude wrote. She had discovered during the composing of the Dodd account that she had a gift for it, for the organization of facts into a narrative that moved efficiently and held attention. She began contributing pieces to the Rocky Mountain News on topics related to homesteading and land rights in the Colorado Territory, pieces that were practical and well-researched, and that were read. She was told by the editor, who paid her fairly for them, by a significant audience of people in the territory who recognized their own experience in what she wrote. She wrote under her own name, Gertrude Monroe Redmond, and used both because she had built a life under Monroe and was building another under Redmond, and both were true of her. In the spring of 1886, she discovered she was expecting a second child. This one arrived in November, a girl, born in the same bedroom Hugh had built onto the farmhouse and healthy from the first moment in the world, with her mother's auburn hair and what appeared to be entirely her own personality, which announced itself promptly and forcefully. They named her Clara Ann Redmond, and James, who was 2.5 and had recently become verbal about his opinions on most subjects, inspected his sister with serious attention and then declared her acceptable, which Gertrude found extremely funny and Hugh found a reasonable position. The family grew into itself. James learned to walk and then to run and then, because he was his mother's child at the fundamental level, to work, following his father through the yard with a small version of the tools and attempting to participate in everything with more enthusiasm than skill, which Hugh encouraged with a patience that Gertrude found, every single time she observed it, worth everything. Clara was a quieter child than her brother, which was not the same as a passive one. She watched. She observed. She had her mother's habit of waiting until she understood something fully before speaking on it, and then speaking with an accuracy that was startling in someone still learning the full range of her vocabulary. Hugh said she reminded him of Gertrude, and Gertrude said that was the finest compliment she had ever received. Samuel Bates, who had never been effusive, became in these years something close to a grandfather to both children, a steady, reliable presence who brought small things from town when he came by and who taught James the proper way to assess soil quality by the touch and smell of it when the boy was 4 years old, which was information James retained with perfect fidelity and still knew at 9. The case of Caleb Dodd and Prairie Crown Holdings remained, years later, a reference point in territorial legal circles. The complete account that Hugh and Gertrude had written for the Denver newspaper was later republished in a collection of accounts about land fraud in the Western Territories. Gertrude was identified in the collection as the witness whose testimony had been central to the federal case, which gave her a satisfaction she did not speak about often but held closely. Hugh's past was not entirely absent from the present. There were times, fewer as the years went on but never entirely gone, when he woke at night with the particular quality of restlessness that came from carrying the weight of Beaumont Crossing. The betrayal had not destroyed him, but it had left a mark, the way a healed bone is sometimes denser and slightly different at the site of the old fracture. Gertrude knew the signs of it, and she did not try to talk him out of it or tell him it should be finished. She put her hand on his back in the dark and stayed awake until the restlessness passed. That was what was needed, and she was glad to provide it. He did the same for her. There were her own nights, fewer also as time went on, when the particular loneliness of the years before he came would surface in the small hours, that specific ache of having wanted a partner and not had one for so long. He would sense it even in sleep and wake and turn to her, and the warmth of him was always sufficient. They were not a perfect partnership, they argued. They were both too certain of their own assessments, and not always quick enough to allow the other person's assessment equal standing. And there were weeks where the friction of that produced a sharp-edged atmosphere in the house that both children navigated with the instinctive adaptability of children who are fundamentally secure, and therefore not frightened by their parents having disagreements. The disagreements always resolved, because both of them were, at the bottom, committed to the resolution, and neither of them had any patience for the carrying of grudges when there was actual work to do and children to feed and a farm to maintain. In 1888, with James 4 years old and Clara 2, they acquired an additional 40 acres adjacent to the east boundary of the original homestead, purchased from a family moving back east through a legitimate transaction at a fair price that Hugh negotiated with the same methodical thoroughness he brought to everything. The additional acres went into a second wheat variety they had been reading about, a harder winter wheat that was showing promise in the Kansas experimental stations, and the diversification of the crop proved wise when a dry summer in 1889 hit the single variety farms harder than the diversified ones. The farm was, by 1889, a genuine success by any reasonable measure. Not wealthy, there was no easy wealth in High Plains farming, but stable and growing and connected to the community of Cimarron Springs in ways that were productive and mutual. Hugh had a reputation in the area that was built on competence and honesty, and the very direct manner he had of dealing with people, which some found abrasive and most found refreshing. Gertrude was known for her writing, and for the practical advice she gave freely to any neighboring family who asked, which was freely given because she believed that information shared strengthened the community that surrounded and partly sustained her. They were invited to speak at a territorial homesteaders gathering in Denver in the summer of 1889, both of them, on the subjects of land security and the importance of federal land documentation. They went and left the children with Samuel Bates, who took this responsibility with the same unfazed steadiness he brought to everything, and spent 4 days in Denver, which was a city by now, and felt enormous after 7 years on the Colorado plains. Gertrude was the more interesting speaker of the two, not because Hugh was inarticulate, but because she spoke from an experience that was both specific and representative in a way that landed with the audience, particularly the women in the room who recognized in her account the particular vulnerability and particular strength of the woman, alone, managing a claim in a system that had not been designed with her in mind. Coming back on the train, with the mountains to the west and the plains opening out ahead of them, Hugh put his arm around her in the bench seat of the railcar, and she leaned against him and watched the landscape go by. "We should have a third," he said. She turned her head and looked at him. "Should we?" "I believe so," he said. "The farm could use another hand in 15 years. You are planning a labor force," she said. "I am planning a family," he said, grinning, and the grin was the full-faced open one she had been collecting for 7 years and never tired of. "We will discuss it," she said, which they both knew meant yes. Their third child, a second son they named Robert Hugh Redmond, arrived in April of 1891, and the arrival of him was different from the two previous in the sense that by the time Robert appeared there was a household already shaped around children, and he arrived into it, and fitted in with the smooth integration of someone coming home rather than someone entering a new place. James, 7 years old by then, was fascinated by his brother with a devoted seriousness that occasionally expressed itself as following the baby around the house, narrating observations about him to anyone who would listen. Clara, who was 5 and had the focused intensity of someone who was going to be excellent at whatever she decided to do, appointed herself Robert's primary guardian, and took this role more seriously than most adults took their employment. Hugh held the infant on the evening after his birth while Gertrude slept, sitting in the chair by the bedroom window with the Colorado darkness outside and the lamp turned low, and talked to his son in the same low murmur he had used with James years before. Gertrude woke briefly and heard the sound of it and lay still in the half-darkness listening, and what she felt was a completion so full and so clean that the word for it was very simple, and she used it to herself without embarrassment. This was it. This was the life. Not the absence of difficulty. There would always be difficulty. The dry years and the cold winters, and the market prices that rose and fell for reasons that had nothing to do with the quality of the wheat or the effort of the labor, and the occasional threat of the wider world intruding on the specific world they had built. Not the absence of doubt or regret or the particular ache of roads not taken. But this specific warm room with these specific people, the sound of a man she loved talking quietly to their child, the fields outside that she had worked and protected and would continue to work and protect, The knowledge that tomorrow and the day after would bring the same fundamental structure of meaning and connection. She had chosen. She had kept choosing, every day, and the accumulated weight of those choices had made something real. In the spring of 1893, the older couple from the adjacent farm came to them with a proposal. The man's health was declining, his wife could not manage the larger farm alone, and they wished to sell to someone who would work the land rather than parcel it for speculation. They offered it to Hugh and Gertrude first. The price was fair, arrived at with genuine mutual respect, and Hugh and Gertrude sat at their kitchen table and went through the numbers with the thoroughness of people who had been managing a farm budget for a decade and understood exactly what they could carry. They bought it. The expanded operation required more labor, and they hired 2 men through the summer planting season, young brothers from a farming family 2 towns over who were competent and reliable, and who learned the particular methods of the Redmond farm quickly. By the 3rd season, they were as integral to the operation as the equipment itself. James, who was 9 in 1893, went to the school his father had built and came home in the afternoons with the red dirt energy of a boy who had spent the day inside against his nature and needed to be in motion. He worked alongside Hugh with an aptitude for the farm that was genuine and not performed, and Hugh was careful never to take that aptitude for granted or assume James had no other possible future, always asking what the boy was reading and what he was thinking about and maintaining the space for a future that could be something else if James eventually wanted it to be. Clara was at 9, and then 10, and then 11, the child who most clearly showed both her parents in equal measure. She had her mother's analytical mind and her father's capacity for patience, and she read everything she could get hold of, which in a farm community in the 1890s was limited to what the town lending library carried and what her mother ordered from Denver, and Gertrude ordered generously. Clara wanted to be a doctor. She announced at 10 years old and said it not as a wish but as a plan, and neither of her parents told her it was unlikely. Her mother said that the path would require considerable determination, and her father said he would be first in line for her services when she qualified. Robert grew up in a household that by the time he was of an age to form memories had settled into a deep, sun-warmed competence. He learned the farm before he learned to read, and the farm before anything else was where he was most himself, outdoors in all weathers, comfortable with the animals in the particular way of a person who has been around them from birth. He was quieter than either of his siblings, more like his father in that quality of observant stillness, and he had from a very young age the capacity to sit beside a person without speaking and have that sitting be a genuine comfort. In the evenings, after the children were in bed, Hugh and Gertrude had the kitchen to themselves, and they used it the same way they had always used it, for coffee and conversation and the particular pleasure of 2 people who are genuinely interested in each other's minds and have enough years behind them to know how rare that is. The topics changed as the world changed around them. The country was changing through the 1890s in ways that touched even a farm in Colorado, economic troubles that hit agricultural prices and required belt-tightening, and the careful management that Gertrude was constitutionally suited for, political movements that she followed in the newspapers with engaged attention, the continuing expansion of the railroad networks that made the territory more connected to everything, and also more subject to the pressures of everything. Hugh, who had spent his young life in service to law and order, and had emerged from that service with a clear-eyed view of how power operated, was not naive about what the changes meant for farming communities. He became involved in the local farmers' cooperative that organized in the mid-1890s, attending meetings and contributing the same methodical analysis he had once applied to criminal investigations to the question of how collective organization could give individual farms leverage they could not achieve alone. Gertrude contributed to the cooperative's newsletter, and the newsletter's circulation tripled in the first year of her involvement. They were useful to each other. They were useful to the community. They were useful to their children in the specific way that parents are useful when they demonstrate through their own lives that love is a practice as much as a feeling, and that practice, sustained over years, builds something that no single dramatic moment could construct alone. The farmhouse had been added to 3 times by the time Robert was 10 years old. The addition Hugh had built in 1882's winter had been followed by a proper sitting room when Clara was born, and a larger kitchen that Gertrude had insisted on, and which Hugh had built to her specifications precisely, because she understood the kitchen as the working center of the house, and not as a space where she was to be accommodated. The house was large by local standards and comfortable in all the ways that mattered, warm in winter, cool as it could be made in summer, full of books and the smell of good cooking, and the noise of children at various stages of their development. On the evening of their 10th wedding anniversary, March of 1893, Hugh built a fire in the sitting room after the children were asleep, and opened a bottle of wine that Samuel Bates had brought by the previous week, with an attached note in Samuel's economical hand that said simply, 10 years, and which they had both found very moving. They sat together on the settee in front of the fire, her feet tucked under her and his arm around her shoulders, and they did not talk for a while, which was one of the many things they had become very good at together. "Do you think about Dodd's men sometimes?" she asked. "The men who were riding after you when you came to the door that night?" "Occasionally," he said, "less than I used to. They changed everything," she said. "If they had not shot you, you would not have needed to stop, you would have ridden past." "I might have stopped anyway," he said. "You said you were looking for me." "I was," he said. "I did not know that was what it was exactly, but I was." He was quiet for a moment. "I think when a person has been broken down to their actual self, stripped of the role and the reputation and all the scaffolding they built up around who they were supposed to be, sometimes the stripped-down self knows things the scaffolding was hiding. And the thing I knew was that I wanted the life I had not had. The real one. The one that was not the badge and the mission and the next case. You wanted to be found," she said. "I wanted to find someone worth being found by," he said. She looked at the fire. "You came to my door a complete wreck," she said. "I know. You were bleeding on my porch. I know. And you said perhaps the most presumptuous thing a stranger could say to a woman he had never met. In my defense," he said, "I believed it when I said it." "I know you did," she said. "That was why I let you in." She looked up at him. "I had been alone for 3 years and I had made my peace with it, or I thought I had. And then you said that, and something in me understood that the peace I had made was not the permanent kind. It was just the available kind, and the permanent kind was in the category of things I still wanted." "And now?" he asked. She looked at the fire and at the room around them and at the man beside her and said, "And now I have it. The permanent kind." She settled further into him. "Do not be insufferable about it." He laughed, and the laugh moved through his chest and into her where she leaned against him, and it felt like everything. The years that followed continued to build. James grew into a young man who was genuinely good at farming, and who at 19 went to work for the Agricultural Experimental Station in Denver for 2 years to learn the science behind the practices he had grown up inside of, and came home at 21 with new knowledge and married, to a capable young woman named Agnes who arrived at the Redmond farm, and looked it over with a practical eye that told Gertrude everything she needed to know, which was that Agnes was going to be fine. Clara pursued her plan with the determination she had announced it with at 10 years old, studying first in Denver and then, through a combination of her own formidable will and the connections her mother had built through her writing work and her cooperative involvement, studying at a women's medical college in the East. She became a physician. Not easily, not without the specific and considerable friction that the world applied to women who wanted things it had decided they should not want, but with a completeness that was entirely her own. She came back to Colorado. She set up practice in Denver and eventually, with a partner she met during her training and who had her same quality of quiet, ferocious competence, made a life that was different from her mother's in its external shape, but built on the same interior principle. Robert stayed on the farm. This was not a diminished destiny. He brought to the farm the full intelligence and attention of a man who had always known exactly where he belonged, and he worked alongside his father and later, as Hugh's age began to show in the mornings and the longer days, increasingly as the primary farmer, while Hugh's role shifted toward the management and the knowledge sharing that was its own kind of labor. Robert married at 25, a quiet and funny woman named Helen who had grown up on a farm 2 counties over and who knew wheat and cattle and had strong views about most things, which she expressed in a dry, understated way that Gertrude found enormously entertaining from the first dinner she shared with Helen at the Redmond table. Gertrude and Hugh grew old in the farmhouse. Not at the same pace, because these things are never equal, and Hugh felt the years in his body first in the way of men who had used their bodies hard in their youth, the old ribs that ached in cold, wet weather, the shoulder that had been cut in that long-ago scouting accident, and that now limited his overhead reach, the general slowing that he accepted without complaint because complaining was not useful. But his mind remained what it had always been, sharp and curious and engaged, and he read voraciously and kept up the correspondence with Thaddeus Vane, who had retired to New Mexico and who wrote letters that were factual and dry and deeply affectionate in the way of men of that generation, who expressed feeling through the steadiness of sustained contact. Gertrude wrote. She wrote for 30 years, the Rocky Mountain News and other publications, and her pieces about land rights and women's homesteading and the particular experience of building a life on the frontier became, without her having planned this, a kind of archive of a period and a way of life that was already changing even as she documented it. She was not a famous writer and did not seek to be. She was a useful one, and that satisfied her completely. On a late summer evening in 1905, 22 years after they had married, they sat on the porch of the farmhouse that had grown with their family and watched the sun go down behind the mountains and listened to the sounds of the farm settling into evening, the cows at the fence line, Robert and Helen's voices from somewhere near the barn, the laughter of Robert's children who were playing somewhere out of sight in the long golden light. Hugh was 62 years old and looked it in the best sense, weathered into himself, the lines of his face the record of a life lived fully and with intention. Gertrude was 56, and she had earned every year she wore. Her hair had gone silver in her late 40s, and she wore it without apology, and it suited her in the way things that are genuinely true tend to suit the people they are true of. He reached over and took her hand on the arm of the chair without looking at her, watching the mountains, and she let it rest in his. "I have been thinking," he said, "about that night." "Which night specifically?" she said. "The night I came to your door," he said. "Leaking blood on your porch and saying something extremely presumptuous to a woman I had never met." "I remember it," she said. "I have been thinking about how close it came to not happening," he said. "If Dodd's men had not shot me, I would have ridden differently. If Samuel had not pointed me this way, if you had had the shotgun an inch closer to hand," he paused, "if you had been the kind of person who turned strangers away without looking at them." "I am not that person," she said. "No," he said, "you are not." He pressed her hand. "I am grateful for every specific thing that put me on that porch and not somewhere else." She turned and looked at him in the evening light, this man she had been watching and knowing for 23 years, who still had the capacity to say something that landed in the exact center of her. "So am I," she said, "for every specific thing." The mountains caught the last of the light and held it for a long moment, that particular quality of evening gold that the high country made before releasing the day, and the field stretched out from the farmhouse in every direction. 160 original acres expanded to 240 by purchase and care, and the slow accumulation of a life's work. And the wheat was in, and the harvest was good, and the children were here, and the man beside her was exactly and precisely the right man. The one she had not been looking for because she had not known he existed, and who had arrived at her door one October night in 1882, broken and certain of something he could not quite name, and said the most honest thing she had ever heard a stranger say. She held his hand in the evening light and listened to the farm breathe around them and felt, in the fullest and most complete sense of the word, that she was exactly where she was supposed to be, in the life she had built and protected and shared, in the company of the person she had chosen and kept choosing, every day, in all the ordinary and extraordinary ways that love, real love, the lasting kind, the kind that is built rather than found, makes itself known. The sun finished its descent. The first star appeared above the mountains. The farm went on,